right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Setting History Straight. Tonight we have with us Sandy Funk. And so tonight we're going to be telling the story of Joshua. And we're going to first start by talking about Joshua and his name.
His name means salvation or Yahweh delivers, which Yahweh delivers truly applies to this story of Joshua that we're getting ready to get into.
Now, he had a former name. His name was changed.
Yes, his name was changed from Hoshea. I believe that's mentioned in the book of Numbers. He started as Moshe's servant.
All right. And a lot of times you'll see that happen, that God pulls people from the bottom of the ranks and really works with them and makes them a leader. And in this case, that's what he did. And if you read Numbers 13, verse 8, it tells you that Joshua was the son of Nun and that he was from the tribe of Ephraim. And in Numbers 13, verse 6, Caleb was the son of the tribe of Judah.
The book of Joshua takes place right where the 5 books of Moshe end. So if we go back to the last chapter of Deuteronomy, it kind of gives us a setting and a place for, what exactly is happening. So Joshua had an extremely difficult task to try to fill the shoes of, it must have been very intimidating. And even though Joshua did become a great and awesome leader, we know by the first chapter of the book of Joshua that he was needing a lot of encouragement. Yahweh tells him to be strong and of good courage at least 4 times.
And there was a reason why he told him to be strong. And when the Israelites were first coming into the land of Canaan, they went through the land of Edom. They went through the land of Moab, which was located under the land of Canaan. And as they began coming up into the land of Ammon, is when they faced their first battle. And Moses was still alive at that point. And they were able to take down the huge army of the people that were called the Amorites. Now, I just want to mention that because that's why God kept telling Joshua, be strong, and he kept encouraging him because there was something very unique about the Amorites that many people miss in Scripture. And I want to just take a second and explain who these people were. The Amorites, if you read Amos 2, verse 9, it tells you that the Amorites were of the height of the cedars. They were strong as oaks. And so this king that had come into the land, his name was Shiho, and he was the king of the Amorites, and he had already taken the land of Moab. So all the land on the east side of the Jordan River, this king named Shiho had already taken that area. And so he was not going to allow Moses to come into that area. And the Israelites utterly destroyed not only his army, but destroyed every living, breathing thing.
Yes.
And the reason that these people were so afraid is because the Ammonites were as tall as cedars. And many people don't catch that in Scripture. They don't understand who these people were.
Well, I agree that Joshua was an excellent military leader. A lot of modern day teachers compare him to Patton or Montgomery. Yes, and his success, therefore, wasn't based on his abilities, though he had great abilities, but rather on his obedience.
That's absolutely true. Now, another miracle occurred when they crossed the River Jordan, and what basically happened is the same thing that happened with Moses, that the river actually parted and the people were able to walk across. Now, it's interesting that I don't think it parted until the Levites stuck their feet in the water. They stuck their feet in the water and it began to open up and they were able to walk across. And when they got on the other side of the Jordan, they did something very unique. They took and they made 2 monuments. And the first monument is on the bank of the river, and it had 12 stones, each one representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And then they took and put 12 more stones in the water. In the middle of the Jordan, they put 12 more stones. And there was a reason for that. And the first step was to enter the water, and they crossed the Jordan on dry ground. And the water did not recede until the priest put his foot in. And it took faith to take that step, just like we do today. It takes faith to take a step. Go
Yes,
ahead.
absolutely, Linda. That's really interesting that you brought that up, because when I was looking into this about the Jordan River, the name in Hebrew is Yarden, and
Oh,
it means
wow.
dark. It means dark of the moon. So and it refers to the conjunction. It's very dark. You can't see. And you just hit the nail on the head, because it does remind me of faith also. But because they followed Yahweh by faith, the darkness turned into light. So Yahweh reveals himself to those who are waiting on his deliverance, whether we're even when we're in the darkness. I just
Exactly.
I just think that's so awesome.
I think that is awesome. And the interesting thing about those 12 stones that were in the river is that is the exact location where the Messiah was baptized by John the Baptist.
Awesome.
In history, it was called Beth Abara, which means the house of passage. And I thought it was interesting that he was referring to the 12 tribes at that spot which were called the house of passage. And it may have been that when it was referenced in the New Testament and in Matthew 3:9, it says, we have Abraham our father, and I say unto you that God is able of these stones to raise up children unto Abraham. It may have been that they were actually pointing to those very stones at that time, because it's talking about these stones right here. So these things happen, and God had to plan this in advance. So he put these stones in the middle of the Jordan River, and then 1,000 years or more later, the Messiah is baptized at that point in the river. And
That
it's unbelievable that he had to plan this in advance. There's no way it could have happened without previous planning.
and that's really a good point, Linda, because we need to understand that if we're walking in the light, we are really listening to him and his instructions. We don't have to worry about the future and what is before us. He's lighting the path ahead of us, and all we have to do is walk in belief and keep that faith and let go of trying to control and manipulate our circumstances. That Yahweh, he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that same great Elohim that led these children and performed all these awesome miracles, and his mercy for those that put their trust in him.
Exactly. Now we want to talk about the battles that Joshua was involved in. And the campaigns that he did took 7 years, and the army had 8,000 men, and Joshua led 13 different recorded battles. And it's interesting that the same numbers keep coming up over and over again. The number 7 and the number 13. 13 is always related to Israel. And it's even when the Israelites were in Europe, as Parthians, they went to war with Rome, and they fought 13 battles with Rome. You see these numbers keep reappearing over and over again. I just think it's more than interesting.
Absolutely.
Now, at this point, they'd already destroyed unbelievable armies in the Middle East, which was the Amorites. They were giants. That's almost like a fairy tale when you hear these stories. It makes it so hard to believe that these things occurred. And so when he went up against the next group, which was King Og of Bashan, the same thing happened. He was able to defeat that group also, and strategically he had to do that because he couldn't leave another army in his ranks behind him, because at some point he would come back to attack. So Joshua's strategy was to actually take the mountain range that was in the land of Israel. It actually runs the length of the land of Israel. The reason he needed to take it is because he could not fight the Canaanites. Not only were they extremely powerful, they had more military weapons, and they had chariots, which Joshua didn't have. So he wanted to take the high ground. That was his plan, was to take the high ground. So the next battle we want to talk about is probably one of the most favorite ones and well known, and that is the Battle of Jericho. Now, Jericho had 2 walls. The 2 walls were 12 feet apart, and they were 30 feet high, and they stretched 1,400 yards around. And we believe that there was only about 2,500 people in the city of Jericho. So, Sandy, can you tell us a little bit about what the word Jericho means?
The name Jericho actually comes from the noun Yara, and it's referring to the moon. The studies that I saw explain that it could possibly mean city of the moon. The Jordan River meant the dark of the moon. Well, so the city of Jericho and the Jordan River are really closely related. And these are just one of many patterns where Yahweh completes these cycles to show how he really is leading, and he's the one that this is all about. When we are allowing ourselves to be vessels for him, even knowing that these men could have not done anything, without his mighty hand being involved, it should really get us excited about the way that everything is pretty much preordained, but in the overall outcome of the destiny of mankind and the awesome purpose that he has for us.
Absolutely. Now, Jericho, as Sandy mentioned, did mean moon. It meant, they usually called it the city of the moon god. And it's interesting today because Jericho is actually the capital of the Palestinian Liberation Organization today, which I think is, unbelievable. But we remember that the first thing that Joshua did was send in 2 men to Rahab's house. We've heard of the story about Rahab, and, there's a lot of controversy over whether she was a prostitute or not. The word there used in the Hebrew does say prostitute, but a lot of people say that she was an innkeeper also. And I know Josephus says that. Josephus says she was an innkeeper.
I would like to explain a little bit about Rahab's name. In the Hebrew, it was pronounced Rachab. If you break that down into the Hebrew letters, you have the letter Resh, which means head, and then you have the letter Hey, which refers to revelation, and it ends in the Beit, which means house. And to me, it's very clear that Rahab was the spiritual head of her household, and she was a spiritual leader.
Absolutely. But we want to mention there's a reason why she's called a prostitute. And later in history, she would marry a man named Salmon of the tribe of Judah, and she would be the mother of Boaz. And we find that in Matthew 1, verse 5. Now, they went into the city, and they told Rahab that because you have hid us from the people in Jericho, we will protect you when we come in to attack. And so take a red cord and hang that red cord out the window, and we'll recognize that, and we'll make sure that your family is saved. You remember the story of Tamar, and she had the 2 sons, and the first one raised his hand up, and the midwife tied a red cord around his hand, and he was Zerah. And Zerah would become the kings of the Trojan line. And I think it's interesting that the same reference is used about a red cord.
Yes, Linda, I totally agree with that. And also the reference to red, because just like the blood on the doorposts on the first Passover night in Egypt was a sign of protection and deliverance for the house of Israel, so the scarlet cord hanging from the window also signified protection and deliverance for the house of Rahab.
Absolutely. And when the Messiah returns, that talks about that in Revelation 19, I think verse 13, that he will come back in a vestige dipped in blood. Mm-hmm. So I think that's very interesting. Most people think he returns in white. He's returning in red.
Now, again, as you said, Linda, a lot of people are divided on how they think. I do believe personally, because in the Hebrew, it definitely calls her a harlot, but I believe that she later became converted, and she may have then, become an innkeeper as well. It makes sense that, she would. But the important thing in this story is, we don't need to focus on her past sins. We are all guilty, and all of us have the death penalty over us. The importance of this story is understanding that Rahab, through faith, found salvation in the midst of destruction. That is awesome.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought that up. So I just want to make a reference here, because This entire story about Jericho is prophetic because this story parallels to the book of Revelations, because in the book of Revelations you had 7 trumpets, and you have 7 trumpets that occur at the time of the fall of Jericho. Rahab was a type of Israel. Now remember, Israel is talked about in Scripture as playing the harlot. And the 2 spies represented the 2 witnesses that came into the land to witness to Israel, who was, in this case, was Rahab. The name Jericho means moon god, and the moon god is associated with the Muslims. And so Rahab was in the city of Jericho where the Muslims were. So the residents of Jericho represented an Arabic state. Joshua is a type of the Messiah that comes to save Israel, who is represented by Rahab and destroys the Muslim state. So I think it's telling you the whole story of what's going to happen in the book of Revelations. I believe also that played such a significant role here, but we always say that if you want to learn about prophecy, you go to the beginning to learn the end. And so here's a perfect example of that.
In Joshua 2, 8 through 11, she says, I know the Lord has given this land to you. But I think that's why that she's included with a lot of the patriarchs. She's mentioned several times. She's mentioned in Hebrews 11:31, where it says, by faith the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believe not, when she had received the spies with peace. And she's also mentioned in James 2:25, where it says, in the same way was not Rahab the harlot also declared righteous by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way.
Now, I want to talk about how the army of Joshua, the army of the Israelites, marched around the walls of Jericho 7 days in a row, which means that one of those days had to be a Sabbath. And I think that's interesting because a lot of times we have wrong connotation about the Sabbath and what can be done on the Sabbath. There's another example of military being used in the time of the temple with Solomon. Solomon had a security group, and each one was divided into a third, and it tells you that they would actually work on the Sabbath day and protected the temple and the gates. Each one would take turns. Sometimes we have the wrong connotation about the Sabbath and how we were supposed to keep it.
I'm glad you brought up the Sabbath, Linda. Them going over into the promised land and receiving that, Yahweh referred to that as a rest. And for us as believers, we seek a spiritual rest. By our overcoming and allowing Yahweh to work through us, we can achieve that rest. But without faith, it says we cannot enter into that rest. In Hebrews 11:3, it tells us that the wicked generation could not enter into that rest, speaking of the promised land, because of their unbelief. Hebrews 4:1 through 11 also shows that Yahweh equates rest to keeping the Sabbath. Verse 4 tells us, you can read in Exodus 31:13, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed. So he equates it to a refreshing and a rest. And I understand where you're coming from. If you read about the Levites, if it wasn't for the Levites and different ones, most important duties have to be performed on the Sabbath day. So there were allocations made. He does tell us that he made the Sabbath for man and not man for the Sabbath. To those of us who are working Monday through Friday, working and earning our pay for a living, but not the work of Yahweh, which has many duties and responsibilities.
Exactly. That's a very important point. People have so many misconceptions about the Sabbath, so I wanted to make sure that we brought that information up. Thank you for covering that. So the next thing we want to talk about is the next battle that occurs, and that is the Battle of Bethel. And Joshua first sent a reconnaissance group into Bethel to scout out the city, and on the way they came to a very small city called Ai. And Joshua's reconnaissance team reported that Bethel would be easily defeated. So Joshua only sent 600 men in to attack Bethel. He did not really sense that there was any reason from the information that he received from the reconnaissance group that he should do anything any different. And what basically happened is the men in Bethel were expecting the Israelites, and they were hid. So the main army was hid. And the reconnaissance group, the first scouting groups, when they first went in, they went into this area which had a lot of ruins. And all these people were hid in the area of these ruins, and you couldn't see them. And what happened basically is that Israel was attacked and ambushed, and most of that reconnaissance group was killed and destroyed, and the remaining army escaped. Well, at that point, Joshua went to Yahweh to find out why they had lost this battle. And Sandy, can you pick that story up for us?
Unfortunately, there was a horrible tragedy. The way that Yahweh chose at this time to seek out who was the perpetrator and had taken items after the war was fought was to cast lots. It was a system that was used, and I know some of us have read about it in the New Testament, but it was a supernatural way to bring righteous judgment to the people. So after this was done, Joshua found that Achan was the guilty party, and he came to him and had him admit it. And because of that, Achan and his entire family were stoned, and then they were burned in the valley of Achor. It is where this happened. And the valley of Achor is interesting because there is a prophecy that refers to the bride in the book of Hosea. Now, this is an end-time prophecy, and it is referring to the bride of Messiah. I believe it's referring to Achan's sin, because the paragraph says, "And I shall punish her for the days of the Baals, to which she burned incense, and adorned herself with her rings and jewelry, and went after her lovers, and forgot me." And he says, "Therefore, see, I am alluring her, and shall lead her into the wilderness, and shall speak to her heart, and give to her vineyards from there, and the valley of Achor as a door of expectation, or a door of hope. And there she shall respond as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up from the land of Mitzrayim. And it shall be in that day, declares Yahweh, that you call me my husband, and no longer call me my Baal."
After Achan's family were stoned, God allowed Joshua to return with his army. Joshua challenged the Bethelites with an army of only 1,000. He brings in 1,000 people, and he takes and he hides another 2,000 people on the other side of Bethel. Bethelites never knew that they were there. And the Bethelites assumed that Israel only had 1,000 men. Now, they heard all the rumors about Joshua and the Israelites, and there had already been 3 major battles. So they were hyped up for this battle, but then when they saw that Joshua only had 1,000 men, they said, "Oh my goodness, Israel is not as powerful as everybody says." And so what basically took place is they made a really huge mistake in that they took their entire army down to fight the Israelites. When they started pursuing the Israelites on purpose retreated. And this was part of Joshua's plan. Now, what Joshua did at that point is he climbed to the top of the hill and he flashed his sword to signal the rest of the troops that were hidden to join in. And they came down and they burned the city of Bethel and burned that entire area. After they set the city on fire, is that Joshua again flashed his sword to signal the rest of the army, the rest of the 5,000 men, joined the main army in the fight against Bethel. And when the people of Bethel looked behind them and saw their city was burning, and then they looked in front and saw that now they were facing 6,000 men, it must have been a devastating thing to figure out what had happened to them. And, this was one of those cases. The entire army and all the people were destroyed, and the king of Bethel was brought alive, and he was hung on a tree until sundown. This was God's way of dealing with these people. He wanted them wiped out. And if you understand why, these people were worshiping what they call the weather god. And the weather god was a bull. And that bull is who we read about in Scripture called Baal. And he did not want the people of Israel to worship Baal, and he knew that this was their main god, was the weather god. Now, the other reason that they were wiped out is that these people were sacrificing their children on an altar to Baal. That's just unbelievable. It's a fascinating story about Joshua. Now, the next battle we want to talk about is Gibeon. And this is the story, another story that everybody has heard. Joshua comes against the Gibeonites, and they were absolutely terrified because they'd already heard all the stories again about the Israelites. And so they immediately joined a pact with Joshua and joined forces with Joshua, and they actually were included in the army of the Israelites at that point. When he took the area of Gibeon, he cut off the trade route because there's a trade route that ran right through that area. Well, all the kings in the south of Israel, the Canaanite kings, were highly upset. And so what happened is the 5 Canaanite kings began to come to the city of Gibeon. Now, they had an army of 15,000 soldiers, and they had chariots. Now, they had a highly sophisticated military force at that time. And being surrounded, the Gibeonites sent a message to Joshua, and they said, you know, we made a pact with you that you would protect us. And so Joshua honored that pact, and him and his men walked through the night, all night long, and 18 miles in the dark in very rough terrain. It's probably the most difficult terrain to cross in the land of Canaan. And finally, at the very end of the night, they got to the city of Gibeon. And Gibeon is located on a hill in a valley. So you have this valley, and right in the middle is this hill, and Gibeon is located on this hill. And on one side, further away, you had the armies of a man named Adoni-Zedek. And we're going to talk about his name in just a minute here, okay? The Israelites surrounded Gibeon, and just before the sun had come up, Joshua prayed a prayer. Sandy, would you mind reading Joshua 10, verse 12 through 14 for me?
Then Yehoshua spoke to Yahweh in the day when Yahweh gave the Amorites over to the children of Israel, and he said before the eyes of Israel, Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself upon their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Yashar? Thus the sun stopped in the midst of the Shemayim, and did not hasten to go down for an entire day. And there has been no day like that, before it or after it, that Yahweh listened to the voice of a man, because Yahweh fought for Israel.
I think that's unbelievable.
Awesome.
You know, that you would pray a prayer that the sun and moon stops. What kind of faith do you have that you would believe that God would stop the sun and moon from going down and coming up? I think it's just incredible to think about it.
They didn't really seek Yahweh's advice this time. And they made this pact with these people and made a covenant without first consulting Yahweh.
Absolutely.
So, but it does show again his mercy, because they turn right around and have one of the most outstanding achievements in battle that has ever been.
Well, you know, that's what our whole life is about. We make mistakes and we do things that we shouldn't, and God is the one that steps in and fixes it.
Yes, amen.
And we see that in our own lives.
Yes.
Now, right as the sun was coming up, Joshua and his army began to attack this huge army of Canaanites that were camped at the base of that area. Joshua came with his army down the hill, and at the base of the bottom of that hill was the Canaanite armies. And most of them were either just beginning to rise, or many were still sleeping. They were not prepared for battle, and when they saw Joshua and the Israelites come, they began to flee. And they saw that there was no escape for them, so they began to flee. Now, the interesting thing is that this army the Israelites moved 30 miles within the time frame of the event, the time frame of the war. They moved 30 miles and they fought this battle for 30 miles for at least 36 hours. Some people say it was 48 hours. Some people say it was 36 hours. But the entire combat was involved in a 30-mile war. Now, that's unbelievable that people had that kind of stamina. I just think it's unbelievable. Now, I just want to make a comment about the stamina of some of these men. When you read the Bible, you find out that they were just such powerful warriors that you hear about the 300 that were the Spartans, and they were unbelievable military men. And you read about David had a group also called David's 30 men. And some of you may not be familiar, but he had 30 warriors that were hand-chosen by him. And the first one, there was 3 in line, and the first one killed over 800 people in one battle. I mean, and then the second one did something very similar. He fought the entire army of the Philistines by himself. And the third one in line, he jumped into a pit and fought a lion. So these people at this time their bodies were different than ours today, I believe. They had this unbelievable ability and strength that we just today do not have anything close to that. I mean, you read this and it's just amazing to me. Many of the people had fled, and there was a miraculous thing that happened, and it's talked about in Scripture, that there was a meteorite shower that occurred, and it killed many of the people of the Canaanite army, but it never injured anybody in the Israelite army. So how does that happen, Sandy?
This reminds me of the 91st Psalm, where it says, 1,000 will fall at your right hand and no harm shall come near you. And again, we need to apply this today because we're going into a time when it's only going to be by his hand that we're going to be able to have deliverance.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, but before I move off this story, I want to make a comment about what the astronomers have found. The astronomers have found something very interesting because they found that there was a meteor shower that occurred on October 25th, 1404 BC, which would have fit the time frame of Joshua. And Mars makes this orbit, and they come at their closest point every 108 years to the Earth. And it will either occur on March 21st or it will cross paths on October 25th. And it's amazing that it hits on these same days every time, but it does. But a lot of astronomers know about this event, and they relate that and say this event probably occurred at the time of this battle with the Canaanites. And they said this could explain that God used this meteor shower from the orbit of Mars to destroy the rest of the Canaanites. And I also want to make another comment before we leave this story, and that is that Yahweh has to plan these events in advance. Just like he put the rocks in the Jordan because he knew that's where the Messiah would be baptized, he also had to set up this orbit for Mars to fall on the dates that it fell on closest to the Earth, because like we said, this orbit is every 108 years. So it had to fall perfect for it to occur at the same time that Joshua is fighting the Canaanites.
Another thing that comes to mind, Linda, you brought this up, and then and I think you're wanting to talk a little more about it. But when you explained to me about Adonai-Zedek and his name, and we didn't get a chance to get back to that, but his name meaning Lord and Master, Just and Righteous One, and since he's a reference to the end-time Antichrist,
Right.
did you want to talk a little bit more about that and those 5 kings? Because I think that's just fascinating.
Absolutely. We do want to talk about that. Those 5 kings were led by Adonai-Zedek, and his name meant the Lord of Righteousness. And he lived, Sandy, in Jerusalem, and he was the king of Jerusalem at that time. I think that's very interesting because the Antichrist will come from where? He will establish himself in the land of Israel in Jerusalem. And if you read, you can read that in Revelations 13 about the Antichrist. And so this is, again, another parallel, Sandy, to what we've been talking about with these prophetic events being paralleled with the book of Revelations and the book of Joshua. And it's interesting because Joshua's army is representing the Messiah because his name is the same as the Messiah. The Messiah returns with his army and he fights the gathered armies at the end, doesn't he?
Yes.
And
yes,
so
he does.
This is absolutely the same identical pattern that we see occurring in the Old Testament.
In talking about patterns, Linda, one way we can understand that, although, we really respect these leaders and these patriarchs of old, Yahweh shows us, if we look close enough, that it really is about him and his power. The parallels in the books of Moses and the story of Joshua are just very similar. I'm going to mention just a few of them. Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt, and Joshua leads them into Canaan. Moses led the Israelites miraculously across the Red Sea, and as Linda brought up, Joshua led them miraculously across the Jordan River. Moses sends the spies into Canaan, and Joshua sent 2 spies into Jericho. Moses allocates land on the east side of the Jordan, and Joshua allocates land on the west side. Moshe delivered a prolonged address before dying, and so does Joshua. So the parallels between them are just showing that these leaders really come full circle, but it really puts the focus back on Yahweh and how he is truly the one that enables, these men to do what they're doing, because these things they're miraculous. That's the only way to explain the events that are happening. Another interesting thing that's mentioned at the latter part of the book is when Joshua dies, he's 110 years old. We know that Moshe was 120, but they carry Joseph's bones back, and Joseph is the only other leader that dies at the age of 110. So they're connected, at the end of the story of the book of Joshua. If we go to the last chapter, chapter 24, Joshua reminds the people of their forefathers, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. And just as it was important for Israel to know who they were, we need to understand these are not just stories, but true historical events about our ancestors, showing us who we are. Although there were 12 tribes of Israel, only the 4th tribe, Judah, was Jewish. So if we can, I'd like to refer back to Genesis 48. Yeah, and that'll show us who actually, by scriptural truth, was given the name Israel. So I'm reading in Joshua, which is Bereshit in the Hebrew, and I'm in 48, and I'm going to start in on verse 13. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand toward Yisrael's left hand, and Manasseh with his left hand toward Yisrael's right hand, and brought them near him. And Yisrael stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, consciously directing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he barak, which means blessed, Joseph, and said, The Elohim before whom my fathers Abraham, Yitzhak walked, the Elohim who has fed me all my life, long to this day, the messenger who has redeemed me from all evil, barak the use, and let my name be called upon them, and the name of my fathers, Abraham and Yitzhak, and let them increase to a multitude in the midst of the earth. So the name Israel was given to Joseph's 2 sons. And I know you talk a lot about the 12 tribes, Linda, and I think that people need to understand, if they'll just go back and read these simple scriptures, it's very clear as to who our identity is.
Right, and so I think the most telling verse is Genesis 49:1. It says, Let me tell you who you will be at the last days. When people see that, they need to understand that these people that are the descendants of the Israelites are 12 actual nations or peoples at the end time. And it's amazing information, and we just simply ignore it.
Absolutely, because if we go back and read about Father Abraham, that helps us to understand that, the tribe of Judah, the Jews had not even been born yet. They were, Judah was the fourth born son of Jacob, the patriarch Jacob, and Jacob was the grandson of Abraham. So, this going back and understanding this, it really helps us to have our identity, where it needs to be. We need to understand who we are and why we are so drawn, to a lot of these stories.
So let's move on now. And we want to ask, is Joshua written in history? Is he written in any of the history books? Now, Josephus recorded that there were two cities named Tang and Tanger in northern Africa. And there were two white stones placed near a fountain. And on the stones is written, "We are the Canaanites whom Joshua the thief chased away." Now, Josephus was not the only historian that wrote about this. Now, as Joshua pushed the Canaanites out of the land of Israel, or Canaan, they began to migrate into Europe. Now, we know that because all over Europe, anthropologists and archaeologists tell us that the remains of the weather god are all over Europe. Now, I want to tell you something interesting about the weather god, which was Baal. It is pictured in European history as a bull with a god riding it. This is where Europe gets its symbol of Europa. Now many people believe that the mighty Hu, which is written about in the Welsh Triads, the Welsh Triads are the ancient history of Wales. Now this is the quote from the Welsh records. It states, "First was the race of the Cymry who came with Hu the mighty to Prydain." Now, that's in referencing Britain. Now the name Hu comes from the ancient word H-E-S-U-S. And we know that that is the word Jesus with an H on it. Now the word Jesus, Joshua, and Joshua were all the same people, since they didn't use a J in some of the early languages and used an H to substitute. You could see clearly that they're talking about Joshua. It says that he came from the land of the summer, or from the land of the east, and he brought one of the three settlements that came into Britain. It talks about how he pushed the Canaanites into the upper corners of the world. Now, there's proof of that in the Scandinavian history. In the history of Denmark by Psalm, published in 1775, he states that Mendes says that Canaanites, which were driven out by Joshua, came to Scandinavia. And Orgrim Jonah, a historian from Iceland, is quoted saying the same thing. You can find that quote on page 101 in the book of the History of Denmark. Now, it's interesting that the people that are the Lapps in the Arctic Circle in Scandinavia and the people who are the Eskimos are of the same descent. So Joshua did push these people much further than what we realize. Now, here you go. These ancient historians tell us that the people who settled in the area of upper part of Scandinavia were the Canaanites, descendants of the Canaanites. Now, in another book called The Incredible Nordic Origins by Gus Olsen, he states that the archaeology relics found in the area of northern Scandinavia point to Phoenicia and Egypt. And that's on page 14 of his book. Now, the famous historian Bede, who wrote the history of Britain, states that the Picts were a group of people who came from Ireland. Now, the story of the Irish race on page 11 and 12 tells us that the Picts were granted by the Irish a settlement in the area of Scotland. Now, they probably came out of the area of the Raka, which was the state that was located right next to Greece. We say that because Herodias said that the people came out of Thracia. So Joshua is written all through history, but our historians refuse to recognize these ancient patriarchs. Sandy, I just want to make a comment.
Sure.
We do not know what kind of leaders and heroes are going to be in the next few years, because I believe Yahweh is going to work some unbelievable miracles in the next few years.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If we're true believers walking in the footsteps of Yeshua, we can know our ultimate destiny.
Now, I want to thank you, Sandy, for coming on with us today. And we now are approaching the end of our program, and we want to say blessings to all and good night.
Shalom, shalom.